All right. I believe that should have done it. Uh, yeah. Okay. Excellent. So I'm gonna continue exactly where we left off last week, and I want to be as clear as possible. I've got abortion, gender, sexuality, polarization on the board in the title, and that is in fact a large portion of what I intend to speak with you about. But I also want to emphasize courts, and so let me just emphasize that for a moment because I didn't, I think, adequately emphasize it when we began this discussion last week. And I will just say very quickly that the Supreme Court has been reconstituted. I think I've suggested to you that, at least in terms of its core interpretive stance, the view about the Constitution and how to read it, this court may be the most radically conservative, or to put it differently, radically undemocratic court that the United States has had in its entire history. Obviously, we've had courts that have upheld and expanded the right to slavery, upheld Jim Crow as unconstitutionally unproblematic, even in light of the 14th Amendment, and struck down major policy initiatives within the New Deal, right? I could keep going. I'm not saying that this court's decisions are the worst decisions of any court in American history. But what I am saying is the way in which this court reads the Constitution gives it complete supreme control over the meaning of the Constitution, and reads the Constitution in a way that is completely insensitive to any evolutions in the people's understanding of the Constitution, the people in whom the Constitution's name was made and is enacted. And just to be as clear as possible about this, right? The reason that we have this court is because Donald Trump had three appointments to this court. And I would just note the Supreme Court hears at most around 100 cases a year. The federal court system hears thousands of cases a year. The district courts and the circuit courts are responsible for much of what we consider to be constitutional law, as well as, in general, the administration of law in the United States at the federal level. And as profoundly impactful as Donald Trump's 4 years were on the Supreme Court, they were probably still more impactful on the federal bench as a whole. And I think we should anticipate that another 4 years of Donald Trump would profoundly transform the Constitution and the law of the United States in ways that would be very difficult to reverse for a generation at least. And that the federal judiciary is perhaps the most functional institution in the federal government right now. And so that this would be tremendously transformative on American society as a whole. We've spoken a little bit about this before. I'll speak more about it as we get deeper into this. But the idea that the administrative state, the modern panoply of agencies that do much of the work of enforcing regulation on the American economy, on the American food system, on American driver vehicle safety, airline safety, that protect our pharmaceuticals and medicine, our food supply, and by the way, our banking system, our securities, and to be as clear as possible, doesn't always do a perfect or flawless job at that, but that this has become a form of government that we are absolutely reliant on for public health, public safety, economic regulation. It is woven into the fabric of our everyday existence in the 21st century, and it is in the crosshairs of, for instance, the Fifth Circuit Court and the Supreme Court with its serious questions doctrine has increasingly made it clear that it considers the delegation of power to administrative agencies to be something that it has the capacity to review and overturn at will without really much of a clearly articulated doctrinal basis for doing so. All of that to say that although I'm focusing on abortion, gender, sexuality, and polarization, and I think there are good reasons for that. In part, the conservative energy behind the effort to remake the court has a lot to do with the sense that previous courts have undermined traditional values, especially with regards to sex, gender, and race, and that has generated this sustained 50 plus year long campaign to remake the court is absolutely central. But remaking the court will have implications far beyond the implications for abortion. So just a little bit more about why this is the second big issue in this series on what we should be talking about as we approach a national election in 2024. Now, last week we left off by noting how the interaction between technology on the one hand, right? And here we're talking about, first of all, birth control technology. Second of all, abortion technology, that abortion is now 60% of the time done via pills, not via a surgical procedure. That pills also allow women with great efficacy and minimal health risks to control their capacity to become pregnant, right? And hence to exercise a kind of autonomy over bodily functions that the vast majority of girls and women in human history had never been able to do. And that we could go on, right? The technology that allows for in vitro fertilization, so allows women to come out from under the tyranny of the biological clock, the technology that increasingly allows people who do not believe that the way in which their body is constituted adequately reflects the way in which they identify themselves, think themselves, their core sense of self, to alter the appearance and maybe the sexual functioning of their body as well. All of that depends on technological changes. And I'll just note that technology moves of its own accord, at its own pace. These are technical, scientific questions. And I am not one to say we should go wherever the technology takes us. I think, for instance, with digital communication and social media technology, we are doing things that are profoundly risky to ourselves and our democracy by just going where the technology takes us. In this case, I believe most of these technological changes have been autonomy promoting. They've promoted the capacity to come out from under biological determinism. And many people who use this technology believe that it has radically expanded their freedom, their capacity for self determination and choice on core issues about how they lead their lives. And so this is a realm where technology and values have complemented each other. But having said that, and I want to emphasize this more than I did. I think at the end of class last week, I left off in a place where I was emphasizing that positive aspect. I will just note that technological change and cultural change are typically not in sync with each other, right? And so that this technology profoundly altered both the autonomy of individuals whose autonomy had been constrained by their biological liabilities up until that point, and also therefore profoundly transformed the gender roles and structure of our society in a way that has profound cultural implications, but that requires then cultural change to make sense of. And that cultural change for some of us came quickly and easily, but for others of us, the change in gender roles, in sexual morality, in sexual freedom was profoundly threatening. And not just in the sense that this doesn't feel right to me, or I subscribe to an ethical religious worldview that tells me that this is wrong, but also in the sense that deep social structures, the family is a profoundly important social structure. It is where a large part of early childhood socialization takes place. It is where intimacy occurs. It is where we have a realm of privacy to figure out a lot of things about our identities and our relations that the family was fundamentally restructured, right? And yeah, it's worthwhile noting this is not the only social development that led to rapid changes in family structures over the last 100 years. But we now live in a society where more than half of children are born outside of a traditional heteronormative two couple, sorry for the jargon, right? Man, woman, husband, wife, mother, father, family. Uh, More than half of children no longer are conceived and raised in a family that has that structure. And we don't know what the social implications of this change will be. And there's a way in which probably we should be having an intelligent, searching, open conversation about how transformations in the family affect children, affect ultimately society, identity, morality, and what, if anything, we can do about that compatible with core respect for human autonomy and freedom. But having said that, it's hard to unpack that conversation from the conversation about the simple idea that this is unnatural, threatening, the change is occurring way too quickly. And it seems to me that the center does not hold. Things are falling apart and we need to do something about this, right? So I think I need to emphasize more this idea that this provoked a backlash, right? And that the backlash comes from people who continue to subscribe to traditional religious and moral worldviews, but also people who have a certain kind of psychology, uh, traditional or closed psychology, for whom rapid transformation of norms and roles is often experienced as threatening or traumatizing. And that this then has led to a polarization of our politics on these very difficult to compromise on issues, right? And so this has further uh, deepened and accelerated the polarization of Americans and people in other society as well in the 21st century. And then we throw in, by the way, the courts, in particular, the Supreme Court in its role as the final interpreter of the Constitution has been at the cutting edge of many of these developments. We talked about this last week, but Griswold versus Connecticut in the early 1960s saying, you know, this new technology, birth control pills, there is a right to privacy such that women, in consultation with their doctors and their partners, and on the basis of their own conscientious and decision making, need to be able to have the right to make these decisions and not be told by the state whether or not they can utilize this new technology. Obviously, Roe v. Wade fundamentally transformed access to abortion, as has the Dobbs decision, the Obergefell decision, which I think very well known, but not by name, right? The decision that granted a right to homosexual marriage across the United States. The fact that the courts have been on the cutting edge of these developments, protecting the access to this technology and the idea of transformed gender and sex relations as fundamental constitutional rights anchored in a right to privacy, understood as protecting personal autonomy in making these decisions, has also made the courts the focus of the backlash, right? And so this then gets us to the place where the court system is being remade. And this is the sustained, strategic, patient, careful, intelligent, and very expensive campaign of organizations like the Federalist Society for the last 50 years. And here I'll just say very quickly that there's a peculiar confluence um, of ideas that the social and privacy and autonomy protecting jurisprudence of the middle of the 20th century or the second half of the 20th century coincides with, or at least is seen as overlapping with, two other developments: the transformation of the Constitution into a uh, method for promoting racial equality in a period where politically we were not as capable of doing this. So the landmark civil rights decisions of the 50s and 60s in many ways enable the landmark civil rights legislation of the 60s and 70s. And so again, the court on the edge of the transformation of not only gender and sex, but also race, status, and roles and norms in our society. And then one more issue that needs to be understood as caught up in this transformation, and that is the role of government in regulating the economy. And here, I think in a part you begin to understand how, on the one hand, there's a lot of energy in the idea of protecting the family, protecting tradition, protecting religion, that this is a mobilizing political issue for many people in America. And on the other hand, a lot of money that goes into these campaigns, because the same constitutional philosophy which justifies rolling back some of the advances in protection of sexual autonomy, access to technology that gives us greater control over our biology, also warrants rolling back aspects of the administrative state as not, in fact, compatible with the original meaning of an 18th century constitution. And so the effort to remake the courts not only attracts a lot of evangelical and conservative cultural energy, it also attracts at least $500 million in contributions, primarily from very wealthy individuals and corporations who stand to profit considerably from rolling back the administrative state. So if that helps to balance out then where we left off last week, let's get into some of the newer material. It's funny. I'm actually teaching Emil Durkheim, from whom I derive this diagram in class at Sarah Lawrence this week. But let me just note that this diagram is meant to indicate, and here I'll use Durkheim's language, what a healthy society does for its members. And so Durkheim believes that there is a core function that every society performs for its individuals, and that as societies stop performing that function or fail to perform that function in the right way, society begins to break down, become what he calls more pathological, and that is manifest in individual behavior, right? The book that this diagram is derived from is called Suicide. And he's interested to explain why suicide sometimes increases, not because of psychological, but because of sociological factors. And Durkheim, right, a Jewish Frenchman from the late 19th, early 20th century, lives through the Dreyfus Affair, which in many ways is the beginning of a state-managed anti-Semitism, which obviously by the middle of the 20th century becomes a form of genocidal nationalism. That this um, uh, threat to the individual from a breakdown in society's performing its core functions can also manifest itself politically. So those core functions, we've spoken a little bit about this before. Durkheim sees as twofold: moral regulation. Individuals cannot completely construct from whole cloth on their own morality. There's a phrase that is used by those who are interested in interpreting Durkheim: socialization precedes individuation. In other words, we craft our individual identities from the resources, the repertoire of cultural norms, the menu of possible identities that our society furnishes us with. And morals is one of those key sets of resources. What can and can't I do? What is right and what is wrong? What is permitted? What's in that realm of indeterminate behavior, where I can experiment and try to figure out what I want to do with my life? Society gives us the resources to do that. The other dimension is social integration. And social integration is the provision of social roles that allow one to play a valued role in your society. What does it mean to be a mother or a father, a child, a son or a daughter? What does it mean to be a husband or a wife, to be an employee, or to be active in one's community under various descriptions? And again, Durkheim's suggestion is that we define these roles for ourselves within the scripts that our society provides us with. And so we know that there are many different ways of playing Hamlet, but all of them work within the confines of the character and the script that Shakespeare originally described. And similarly, there may be many different ways of being a father, a mother, a husband, a wife, but the core role is furnished for us by society. And Durkheim's view, and maybe there really should be three circles here as opposed to two, is that there is such a thing as society doing too much, doing the right amount, and doing too little. And that when it does too much, we tend to feel confined by our roles. And as if our freedom is abridged by society's shared morality. When there's too little, we tend to feel that everything is allowed, nothing is required, and that we don't really know what is expected of us. And both of these developments, too little and too much, Durkheim refers to as pathologies. And now let me complicate Durkheim's idea as if it weren't complicated enough. What if what for some individuals is too much, for others is just right? Or for what is just right for some is right too little for others. This seems to this diagram indicate there's a right answer. There's a Goldilocks zone, just the right amount of social integration and moral regulation, but that may not be uniformly true, and that what has happened in the United States with the transformation of gender and sexual morality in the 20th century, the last third of the 20th century, the first quarter of the 21st century, has certainly changed the way in which society regulates the individual, the roles available to us, the degree of shared expectations on us. And for some of us, this is liberating. For others of us, this is pathological and needs to be repaired, right? And whether ultimately we will conclude 50 years from now or 100 years from now that we've reached a new consensus on what adequate social regulation of individuals is, or instead whether we've become deeply pluralistic about this and we've got to figure out how to balance different ideas about what people want from their society. I think it's too early to know. We'll have to wait and see. But in the moment we're in, clearly some of us feel that there's too little social integration and moral regulation, that the revolution of the last 50 years is an unmooring and ultimately anarchic revolution, and that greater regulation, greater integration, greater legal enforcement of shared sexual morality is required to keep society healthy and individuals happy. And this goes back to then what I say I didn't emphasize enough last week, the sense of threat, the sense that in the 21st century, it's very difficult to raise your children with the values that you were raised with, and that this is, in essence, the use of the state to undermine your religion, your culture, because, of course, you have to send your children to school. This is required by law. And yet, if the school is seen as a locus of secular indoctrination, then obviously many people are protesting, are trying to reverse what they see as a culture and a legal system that is hostile to their values. Now, within this broad framework, I want to first focus on abortion and why abortion has become such a flashpoint in our culture wars. Why focus on abortion, right? And I want to suggest that there are two related grounds for objecting to abortion that are really important in explaining the salience of this issue to our historical moment in recent politics. One of them is religiously grounded, right? And so the idea that human biology, sexual biology, reflects the purpose for which we were made by our Creator. That it is not just evolved, but meaningfully intended. And hence, that when we intervene in our biology to disrupt our nature or to modify it or to alter it, well, we may be increasing our autonomy, but we're also playing God with our biology. And in so doing, we are an affront to the very purpose, the very meaning embedded in our biology. And so that's one kind of objection to abortion. A second kind of objection, and this is the one that's more common, kind of straddles these two grounds, and that is that abortion is the ending of an innocent life and therefore unacceptable under most doctrines of law and most understandings of morality, right? And so there may be some very few conditions in which it's okay to take an innocent life, but they are rare and exceptional, and abortion almost never meets those conditions. Yes, there may be some cases where the pregnancy has to be terminated in order to save the woman's life, or where the pregnancy resulted from a crime having been committed against the woman. And those may be muddy, difficult cases, but generally speaking, that's not the vast proportion of abortions that occur in our society. And so a religious view of this is that a fetus, a zygote, from the moment of conception is ensouled by God. And so, from a religious metaphysical perspective, from the moment of conception, that is a full fledged human life that abortion terminates. From a more secular human rights perspective, if we're agnostic about whether or not a fetus is a person, we should err on the side of not terminating a possible human life, a potential human life, but a human life that we don't know whether or not or exactly when it becomes a fully human life that in general we consider it to be immoral and illegal to end. And so both of these arguments focus our attention on innocent life and do not focus our attention on the idea of reimposing traditional sexual morality, on reconstituting um, patriarchy, and on the implications for women who, if abortion is unavailable, their destiny is once again strongly influenced by their biology. This will especially be the case if the logical implication of overturning Roe v. Wade is ultimately that we also need to overturn the whole string of decisions premised on a right to privacy, a right to procreative autonomy, and that includes Griswold v. Connecticut, and therefore states are free to also ban contraception of various kinds. And please note the way in which, right, the argument from biology being intended by God to have certain meanings and functions, and that we shouldn't be playing God in our biology, does seem to have this implication as well. And so I'm suggesting to you that in a sense, the focus on innocent life here is um, a really important reason why those who are the advocates of the reimposition of traditional morality have focused on abortion. This is for them the um, uh, least objectionable way of making this argument. They do not have to directly advocate reimposing male authority in the family, female consignment to the domestic sphere, a society in which biology is destiny. Now, having said that, I don't think either of these moves works very well, and I'll be as clear as possible about this if I can. And so the first problem is to say that abortion is murder or the termination of an innocent life, or that at least it possibly is, assumes that we can answer the question of when human life begins. And if you ask a doctor to answer that question for you, if you ask a biologist, a medical scientist, I believe if they answer that question on the basis of their professional expertise, what they will say is, I don't know, right? I can tell you with some precision when a fetus becomes viable outside the womb, right? And that in part depends again on the development of technology. And we continue to try to advance that technology so that premature babies are able to survive when those circumstances occur. But if the question is when exactly the thing growing in the uterus, the zygote, the fetus become a person, that's a religious or a metaphysical question. And we, as a matter of both constitutional law, what we've referred to as the separation of church and state, the non-establishment clause of the First Amendment, right, refused to impose our religious views on each other, given what our Constitution says we have rights to do. We have a right to freedom of religion, and that includes not having your religion imposed by law on me, or constraints that you can only justify using a specific religious argument imposed on me. It's part of the reason people have moved to a more secular human rights objection, but they can't really do so without begging the religious or metaphysical question, as far as I can see. And by the way, if democracy requires that we address each other with reasons we believe others can reasonably accept, right? That's a fundamental duty, respecting the political equality of the people with whom I share democratic power. Then democracy, as well as the Constitution, suggests I should not be premising my political action on controversial religious metaphysical views that I know a large number of my fellow citizens reject. And so that's, I think, one way in which the move to abortion has buried these issues that are beginning to come to the surface again, because now the court has overturned Roe v. Wade. A second dimension of this, and Elena Kagan in her dissent in Dobbs brought this out very clearly. She says without abortion, equality ends at the moment of conception. Although, right, the advocates for the right to life and the protection of life, the advocates of banning abortion, say this is all about protecting innocent life. Its clear implication is that women will be more trapped by their biology, have less autonomy, less control over their bodies, and in general, in constitutional law, we tend to recognize when there are competing values and try to balance them. So if there is a constitutional value to expressing respect for the sanctity of life, how do we balance that against the constitutional value of protecting the equality of all persons? And here it seems to me that in a sense, the focus on abortion tries to short circuit or sidestep or do an end run around that issue, but ultimately it fails. Um, and this then brings me to, I think, the more directly political dimension of this. Again, diagrams we've looked at before, um, and so I want to suggest that there is an important trend in our politics, and that is that as women demand rights and organize to escape traditional roles, and we might add, as technological developments allow them greater ability to do so, there is a tendency to uh, demand increased political regulation of women's sexuality and roles in society. And I would point out to you, right, that the idea of the regulation of sexuality and of gender roles are central to many of the world's religions. And so this pulls religion into our politics. It pulls a kind of partisan psychological divide into our politics. It makes for greater polarization. But in addition to that, I think it tends to shift the axis of competition in our politics. I think for many of us, this still feels novel, but I think it's beginning to sink in that in the 21st century, perhaps the most important competition between parties and within democratic politics is not between those who are in favor of a more activist, more regulatory, more redistributive state, and those who are in favor of a more minimal, more libertarian, more free market, less redistributive state. That's a kind of mid 20th century view of the competition between the two main parties in many mature democracies. In the 21st century, the competition is much more between those who want to embrace a multiracial, post-traditional, post-conventional society, a multicultural society, a society that allows immigrants not only to come into their country, but to bring their culture with them, and a society that allows for the transformation of gender and sexual roles and norms. Call those the cosmopolitans, those who are open to relatively rapid cultural change. And on the other hand, those who are saying, stop, this has to stop. We don't want more people coming from the outside and bringing their culture with them. We don't want our traditional social roles, which have an overlay of gender and sex and race in them, to be rapidly and fundamentally transformed. And therefore, we want leaders who will use law to reimpose tradition if tradition is no longer being naturally reproduced in society as part of the cultural reproduction of society. And those right movements tend, therefore, to want to use greater state power to have less respect for the norms of constitutional law and political freedom as those were understood in the middle of the 20th century, and instead to say, no, the state has to intervene in these matters. And this then leads, if there's a party that embraces an effort to construct and impose tradition, once it is no longer simply second nature, this leads to greater polarization, a struggle that is more difficult to find common ground and compromise on than the traditional left right struggle. There are lots of positions between having a fully regulatory redistributive state and having a minimal state. But between these two, there seems to be kind of a night and day choice. It's much harder to fashion compromise or intermediary positions. And so this seems to be driving our polarization. And again, it seems to be really focused on issues of constitutional law. One more set of concepts here that I hope will be helpful to you in thinking about, in particular, the difference between 20th and 21st century gender politics. And so 20th century gender politics occurred in a traditional society where tradition was being challenged by technology and new social movements. Let me spell out the terminology here. A traditional society is one that produces over time a kind of cultural stability. The norms of the current generation, the roles they aim to play, their world views and values are pretty much those of the previous generation, the generation before that, the generation before that. And they've been passed down with the authority of tradition as their central backing. This is the way things have always been. This works. Why should we overturn what has always worked for us? And by the way, why wouldn't you value it? This is who I am and the way I've led my life, and I'm socializing, acculturating you to be the same kind of person I am. We are. This is our identity, our tradition, our way of life. Um, a post traditional society is one in which tradition as such loses its normative power, in which individuals are much more inclined to ask, I understand that this is the way that previous generations have done things, but please give me a reason beyond that for why it's valuable to continue to do things in that way. And please note the very asking of that question tends to be somewhat corrosive of tradition. If tradition is no longer taken for granted, doesn't feel simply natural, right? Why is it that I have to walk to the kitchen if I want to get some food? Well, that's just the nature of being a human being in the physical world. The food doesn't come to you just because you will it, and you can't fly or swim if you're in your house standing on dry ground. You have to walk. That's nature, right? And so we tend not to question that. Um, is culture understood as, given in the same way that the parameters and constraints of the physical world is. This is just the way things are done here. Or is it understood as something that I can question, and that if I determine that it doesn't have value for me, I can reject? And so to just, illustrate for a moment, nearly 50% of Americans change their religion from the religion of their birth. The majority of Americans marry someone of a different denomination from them. The fastest growing category of religious identity in the United States is none of the above, right? I don't identify with any organized religion. And 20% of Americans from the age of 16 to 24 do not identify with the sex on their birth certificate, right? So just all kinds of ways in which we have transitioned rather rapidly from a traditional to a post-traditional society. And for many of us, this may feel like a process of natural cultural evolution. The reason that we're not reproducing our tradition is because that tradition doesn't seem to be worthy of reproduction. It's not valuable for us. But for many others, this is deeply disconcerting, disorienting. It really feels like the very fabric of the social world is disintegrating around us, and we just don't know how to navigate this new world. It doesn't make sense for us. And by the way, for many of us, the roles that were constructed, passed down, enforced by tradition, those roles constitute my sense of self, my social identity, but also my sense of belonging and empowerment. This is part of why Durkheim suggests these roles are so valuable, that they give me a clear sense of what I'm supposed to be doing in that role, and what is allowed, what in fact others have to respect when I ask them to do things because it follows from my role. And so my suggestion to you, right, we've made this rapid transition, in part driven by technology, but in part driven by all kinds of other cultural developments, from a traditional to a post-traditional society. And roughly a third of us think this is a great thing. Roughly a third of us think that this is a catastrophe. Another third are somewhere in the middle. And then if the third who think that this is a catastrophe say, we want to go back to the world that we knew, that we valued, that we were more comfortable in, and we can't simply do that in the taken for granted way that we used to do it, just by socializing our children. The schools, the media, their peers are all suggesting to them alternatives. And by the way, in order to do this, we have to have traditional families, and women's access to contraception and abortion is destroying the traditional family. Those people, if they are to succeed in reimposing tradition, are going to have to use state power to do it, right? And at this point, I think it becomes incredibly important to see how different that project is from where they say they want to get back to, right? Because at this point, tradition is no longer being naturally reproduced. And so minimally, it has its taken for granted character called into question, right? It is no longer simply second nature. Nobody questions why you have to walk to the kitchen, but a lot of people are questioning why the fact that I'm born a woman means that I have to have children, and that I have to have them more or less exactly at the time that I first become eligible to have them, or else I can't have sex. Right? That just doesn't make sense to a large portion of our population, and we're going to have to coercively prevent them from gaining access to the technology that gives them the liberty to reject that tradition. Similarly, and here I think this is absolutely critical. The people trying to reimpose tradition at some level recognize that those on whom they're imposing it, at least many of them, reject the tradition and have to be coerced. This is not simply using law to reinforce what everybody believes, it's using law to reimpose what a substantial portion, perhaps the majority of the population, rejects. And that makes it explicitly authoritarian. And you're faced with this choice. Well, if the tradition is no longer embraced by people, am I going to let it become much less thick, much less taken for granted, much less assumed and obligatory? Or am I going to coercively impose it on people who reject it? And part of what we know about the history of the 20th century, especially the second half, is many of the most important social movements, the feminist movement, the civil rights movement, the immigrant rights movement, even the environmental movement, were premised on the idea that taken for granted central normative cultural roles and identities
Mhm.
were not consensual, but in fact were unequal, coercive, intolerant, maybe even oppressive, right? And so a large portion of the population on whom these norms have to be imposed in the 21st century in order to sustain them spent a substantial portion of the 20th century exactly trying to overturn these norms and their cultural or legal enforcement, right? And so the people who have to impose these norms now recognize actually these norms are not quite what they claim to be, simply natural, taken for granted, shared. A whole bunch of people are telling me they reject them. And if I'm going to simply say I don't take them seriously, I don't believe them, or they are so wrong-headed, their failure to consent, their objections are not worth attaching any weight or significance or value to. That generates an awareness, right? At some level, what I'm doing is using authority to coercively impose tradition on those who do not value this tradition. And that's a fundamentally distinct way of reproducing tradition. Now, I'll very quickly add, right, that for many years, all right, we can go back to Edmund Burke, for instance. We can go back to Catholic social teaching from the 18th and 19th centuries. There's been this sense that, well, yes, we do need institutions to impose traditions because people don't by themselves get to traditional values. But for the most part, that wasn't the state. And for the most part, it was not coercion that was viewed as fundamentally illegitimate from the people on whom the norms are being imposed. And then we add, oh, by the way, the critical lever that we want to control in order to reimpose tradition is the court, is the Constitution, is the law. And please note that if we tried to do this directly politically, we would never win an election, right? Because the third of the people who absolutely reject the legitimacy of these traditions and the third who are on the fence, but generally speaking, are not with us, would carry the day in most elections in this country. And so we have to use an instrument that doesn't make this electorally accountable. And this then leads to the idea of originalism or textualism, the reading of the Constitution as a sacred document of the civic religion of the United States, one that always has to mean what it once meant and not what we want it to mean in the 21st century. And just please note for a moment how much affinity that has with a traditional reading of religion. Our sacred texts are not something that we get to just revise whenever we want to, right? Jefferson famously cut out all the passages in his Bible that he thought were superstitious or unscientific. But most of us don't consider ourselves to have that latitude to edit a sacred text. And in a sense, the conservative originalist position on the Constitution is saying the same thing. It's a sacred text. We're stuck with what it means, and we cannot change its content to suit our present values. I hope you see that affinity between traditionalism about culture and originalism about the Constitution. Why don't I stop there? I know I shared a lot of material with you today. I'm trying to set this up, get all the pieces in place so that we can then start talking in particular about 2024, the election that we're facing. Who wants to start us out with a question or an idea? Please unmute or raise your hand whenever you're ready to speak. So I'm not hearing a question. Let me ask a question of you to begin with. Um, does this framework that I'm suggesting for thinking about one of the central issues of this election, right? So I've mentioned Biden's age, Trump's indictments, the economy and COVID, right? The combination of those two. Um, Immigration and abortion as being like the big five issues as far as the polling and as far as my analysis seem to reveal, and that we should spend some time drilling down on each of those issues. We've talked a fair bit about the economy, about the curse of wealth, about inequality. I feel like we had a good, strong, constructive discussion of those issues. The issues of age and indictments, I've suggested, may, in a sense, be um, not actually in their depths what they appear to be on their surface, right? That it's more a question about what kind of person we want at the helm of our government in the 21st century. The question about immigration, I promise we will talk about in a future series of discussions. But today and last week, I'm focusing us on abortion. Is the framework I'm proposing making sense? Does it seem like the right way to be thinking about this? Wendy, go ahead. I see you've got your hand up. Unmute yourself, please.
Am I on mute? Yes. Where does the fact that the over-reproduction of humans has brought us possibly the end of humanity in this moral questioning?
So, overpopulation, right, is what I understand you to be talking about. And I need to plug in, or else my computer's going to die. I'm going to say very quickly that you're, I think, absolutely right if we're talking on a global scale, right? There are 8 billion people on the planet right now. And by the way, almost all of them want what they see as something like an American lifestyle, that involves eating a lot of beef and maybe driving a car or flying in a plane and having a lot of electronic devices. And by the way, that is, if it is generalized in that way, totally unsustainable, catastrophically self-destructive.
Catastrophically, right.
And then let us just add that the indigenous population of the United States is declining, not increasing, right? So we're not contributing to population growth. And by the way,
Oh,
that I haven't mentioned the white nationalist or the racial nationalist version of this argument. But there is a version of this argument that says the only reason the United States actually has an increasing population in the 21st century is because of immigration. And the people who are coming to the United States, they're from Latin America, or they're from Asia, or they're from Africa, and they're destroying our cultural commonality, would be the nice way to put it, right? And so it's a problem that we're not reproducing fast enough to sustain the current racial cultural composition of the United States. Stop the immigrants and start reproducing domestically, right? There's a version of this argument that has that dimension to it. But
Yes.
but having said all of that, I think on a global scale, access to contraception is incredibly important for and then empowering women, but also development in poor areas of the world, because empowered women actually tend to make economic decisions with domestic resources that tend to foster economic development, and then also in terms of population control. But I'm not sure that that's a strong argument for access to contraception or abortion in the United States, because we're a small piece of that overall puzzle, and we're actually already reducing our population size.
And we don't have a moral responsibility to restrain our urges to populate somewhat.
Yeah,
Just so our children, when we have them, can grow up in a world in where they're fed and can lead a life. Don't
so
we have a moral obligation? I guess it's because they're still all sperm and eggs that it doesn't count or something. I don't know. But when I think about abortion and contraception, I think about not only respecting women as individuals, but respecting a morality that says, I will not have a child until I can take care of that child. I will not have a child if I cannot take care of a child. I will not have a child if I'm in a place where that child can't grow up and flourish. It's more complicated.
yeah, and thank you, Wendy. And I do actually intend to talk about some of those dimensions in
Okay.
a coming lecture. And so there's a study called the Turnaway Study, which studies women who were turned away from abortion and compares them to women who had access to abortion. And part of what it finds is that women who were denied access to abortion, their children are poorer, that the women themselves are more likely to be abused, that they have less education, they're more likely to be in an unhappy
Absolutely.
marriage, right? So there are a whole bunch of reasons to think that actually, if abortion is not immoral or illegal, not murder, then it's good actually for everyone, right? That there be access to abortion. But having said that, let me also point out that I think the environmental argument for abortion is not the strongest argument. And frankly, if what you're really concerned about is the sustainability of the world for future generations, what we should really be concentrating on is eating less red meat, driving
Well,
less,
that too.
taking fewer planes,
That
decreasing
too.
our carbon footprint, regulating the gas and oil industry so they pollute less methane into the atmosphere, right? There are lots of things that we could be doing that would probably be more directly impactful on climate change or the environment than controlling our rate of population growth. And by the way, please note the number of abortions has actually gone up in the aftermath of the Dobbs decision in the United States. And we have to figure out why that is. I don't think anybody knows, but I don't think it's necessarily the case that there are a lot more children coming into the world because abortion is no longer a protected constitutional right in the United States. As opposed to that, it's just become a lot more difficult for especially a lot of poor women to gain access to abortion. Um, and it has the beginnings of a longer term trajectory, which, if we stay on it, may interfere with women's equality and freedom in the 21st century. That seems to me to be the stronger reason to be concerned about it, not the rate of population growth reason. All right, great
It's
question. Thank you for
all a
that, Wendy.
part.
And I will come back, I promise, to thinking about the human dimensions of coercing women into having children when they don't want to. Good. All right, anybody else for today? Well, we've gone over as we tend to do, and so I'm going to go ahead and let everybody go. Be well. Have a good week. Enjoy the nice weather. And serious stuff. We'll be coming back to it next week to begin to get into the 2024 dimensions of all this. Take care, everyone. Thank you, and be well. Bye bye.